In this video, we're going to review some of the rules that we've learned about the seller's remedies under Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code. I've listed the various remedies on the left side of the table in front of you. When are these remedies available? Well, it depends on the circumstances. I've indicated 3 different circumstances on the top of the table in front of you. Let's start with the first column, repudiation or failure to pay. A buyer might repudiate a contract by telling the seller, or indicating through conduct, that the buyer is not going to perform when performance becomes due. The buyer isn't going to pay. A buyer might fail to pay simply by not making a payment when the payment is due. If the buyer repudiates or fails to pay, what are the seller's remedies? Well, Section 2610B says that if a buyer repudiates, the seller is entitled to any remedies that the seller would have with respect to any other type of breach. And Section 2703A says that the seller may simply withhold or suspend delivery. The seller doesn't have to give the goods to the buyer. Under Section 2703F, the seller could also cancel the contract. The seller doesn't have to do these things, though, immediately. Section 2610A says that the seller may await payment or retraction of the repudiation by the buyer. The buyer is entitled to retract the repudiation under Section 2611(1), so long as the seller hasn't relied on it or taken some other action in reliance on the repudiation. In addition, the seller could recover damages, and we talked about 3 different possible damage measures. First, the seller might seek the price of the goods. The seller is entitled to the price of the goods if the goods have been accepted by the buyer, or if they would be difficult to resell for a reasonable price after reasonable efforts. In addition, the seller may recover the difference between the resale price and the contract price, so long as the seller resells the goods in a commercially reasonable manner and in good faith. Third, the seller may be entitled to recover the difference between the contract price and the market price. Although some courts, and we'll talk about this later, some courts have said that the seller cannot recover the market price difference if the seller resells. Finally, the seller may be able to recover the lost profit. In other words, the seller can determine how much profit the seller would have made if the sale had been made. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment too. In addition, the seller could stop delivery if the buyer repudiates or fails to pay. Section 2703B and Section 2705(1) discuss this option. What if the seller finds out that the buyer is insolvent? The buyer hasn't repudiated or failed to pay. It just turns out that after having made the contract, it turns out that the buyer is insolvent, and the seller discovers that. Well, that may give the seller reasonable grounds for feeling insecure, as we'll see, and in which case the seller could demand adequate assurance of performance and suspend performance until that adequate assurance was provided. In addition, the seller could reclaim the goods under Section 2702(2). However, the seller would have to make the claim for reclaim for the goods within 10 days, although that 10-day period does not apply if the buyer misrepresented the buyer's solvency in writing within 3 months before the contract was made. What if the buyer has already sold the goods to somebody else? Well, Section 2702(3) allows the seller to recover the goods from another person unless that person has purchased the goods in good faith or in the ordinary course of business. In addition, if the seller discovers that the buyer is insolvent, the seller could refuse to deliver the goods to the buyer except for cash. Even if the original contract said that the seller was to deliver the goods on credit, the seller could refuse to deliver the goods unless the buyer paid cash for them. In addition, the seller could stop delivery to the buyer. Finally, if the seller merely feels insecure, and this is the third column, if the seller merely feels insecure about the buyer's ability to pay, then the seller's only remedy under Section 26091 is to demand adequate assurance of performance from the buyer. Until the buyer provides that adequate assurance of performance, the seller can suspend delivery, and if the buyer never provides that adequate assurance of performance, the seller may treat, or I should say, if the buyer never provides that, does not provide that adequate assurance of performance within a reasonable time not to exceed 30 days, The seller may treat that failure to provide adequate assurance of performance as a repudiation. Then the seller would have all the remedies that we discussed in the first column. Alright, those are the different sections. This table sort of provides a roadmap. But how do these different sections and remedies play out in the actual argumentation of cases? Well, it's important to realize that many of these remedies are self-help remedies. They're remedies that the seller may resort to without the aid of a court. As a result, the seller may simply not deliver the goods to the buyer. The buyer then may sue the seller, and the seller will present defenses based on these self-help remedies. Here's some examples. Let's suppose that the buyer claims that the seller promised to transfer and deliver goods, but didn't do it. The seller has 5 possible defenses based on these remedies. First, the seller might say, well, I had a right to suspend my performance because the buyer gave me reasonable grounds for feeling insecure. We saw that under Section 2609A. In addition, the seller might say, well, I had a right to cancel the whole contract because the buyer repudiated the whole contract or breached the whole contract by failing to pay when payment was due. That's exactly what happened in Plotnick v. Penn Smelting. Penn Smelting made a counterclaim against Plotnick for failing to deliver future installments. And Plotnick said, well, because you didn't pay for the 3rd installment, I had a right to cancel the whole contract. In addition, the seller might say, well, even if I didn't have a right to cancel the whole contract, I had a right to cancel with respect to one obligation because the buyer repudiated the obligation or failed to pay for it when payment was due. The seller's 4th defense might be, well, I had a right to refuse to deliver, except for cash, because I discovered that the buyer was insolvent. And the 5th defense is, I had a right to stop delivery. I didn't make delivery because I had a right to stop delivery because the buyer repudiated or failed to pay, or because I discovered that the buyer was insolvent. Now, those are various defenses that the remedies give to the seller. Defenses that arise from the seller's ability to execute these remedies, essentially to not deliver the goods because of the buyer's breach. The seller, however, also can use some of these provisions to claim damages upon showing that the buyer has breached the contract or repudiated the contract. For example, let's first talk about the seller's request for the contract price. The seller might claim that the buyer promised to accept and pay for goods and didn't do it. That's the buyer's basic obligation. If the buyer has no defense, well, then the seller would request damages. And the seller might say, well, the buyer should have to pay the contract price for the goods under Section 27091. Now here the buyer might have a reply. The buyer might say, well, the seller is not entitled to the contract price because I didn't accept the goods, and the goods could be resold for a reasonable price after a reasonable effort. Those are the elements of Section 27091. What if the seller wants resale damages? Well, the seller's claim again would be that the buyer promised to accept and pay for goods and didn't do it. If the buyer does not have a defense, the seller might request resale damages, saying that the buyer should have to pay the difference between the contract price and the resale price, plus incidental damages, less expenses saved. Now here the buyer might have a reply. The buyer might say that the seller cannot recover the resale price difference because the seller did not resell the goods in good faith and in a reasonable manner. We saw an example of that in the Afram Export v. Metallurgy case. In that case, one subsidiary attempted to resell the goods to another subsidiary, but the court threw out that sale, saying that it wasn't really a real transaction. It was just designed to set a price of damages, and the court didn't believe that it was an accurate measure of the damages. In other words, it wasn't really a good faith and commercially reasonable sale. Now what if the seller wants market damages? Well, again, the seller would have to claim that the buyer promised to accept and pay for the goods, and that the buyer didn't do it. Again, if the buyer doesn't have any defense, the seller might request damages. The seller might say, well, the buyer should have to pay the difference in the market price and the contract price, plus any incidental damages, less any expenses saved. Now here the buyer again might have a defense. Some courts say that the seller cannot recover market damages if the seller resold the goods at a price above the market price. Most courts say that, but not all courts. There is some contrary authority Comment number 1 to Section 2703 says that there is no doctrine of election of remedies, which implies that even if the seller resells the goods, the seller still could collect the difference between the market price and the contract price. Now, it's worth noting that we saw another attempted reply in Transworld v. Southwire. In that case, the buyer said, well, the seller cannot collect market damages because the seller would make more profit than the seller ever expected to make because the market price had fallen. And the court rejected that and said, well, there's nothing in Section 2708(1) which says that the seller can only collect market damages if the price hasn't fallen. What about the seller's request for lost profit? Well, again, the seller would have to say that the buyer promised to accept and pay for the goods and didn't do it. Then the seller would say that the buyer should have to pay the seller's lost profit as measured by Section 2708(2). That's that complicated formula which looks at the seller's profit plus overhead plus incidental damages, less expenses saved, less proceeds from resale, which usually would be zero, less payments received from the buyer. The buyer may have a reply here. For example, we saw in the R.E. Davis Chemical v. Diasonics case that the buyer may claim that the seller really hasn't lost any profits. The buyer might say that the seller cannot recover the lost profits because the seller is really not a lost volume seller. In other words, the seller could not have made another sale if it had delivered the goods to the buyer. Thus, the seller ended up in the same place that the seller would have been in even if the buyer hadn't reached. Now, there's one other type of remedy that the seller might want. The seller might want to reclaim goods. We've seen that the seller has to make a demand for the goods if the seller discovers that the buyer is insolvent after having delivered the goods. But that doesn't necessarily get the seller the goods. The buyer might not deliver the goods, in which case the seller would have to bring a lawsuit. And the seller's claim would be, I have a right to recover the goods from the defendant because the goods were delivered before I discovered the buyer's insolvency. Now, there are two possible defenses here. The defendant might say, well, the seller did not assert a claim for the goods within 10 days after discovering the buyer's insolvency, after delivering the goods, and that the buyer did not fraudulently misrepresent solvency in writing within 3 months before delivery, and thus there is this limited 10-day period for making a claim. A second defense might arise if the goods have been transferred by the buyer to somebody else, to some third party. If the defendant is some third party, the defendant might say, well, I purchased the goods from the buyer in good faith, or in the ordinary course, and therefore I acquired good title under Section 2403, and you can't recover the goods from me.